Bible story, Jesus, the Peacemaker. "I'm the most important of Jesus' disciples," said Judas. Judas was the one who took care of the money for the disciples. He thought he was very important.
"No, my friendship with Jesus makes me the most important,"
said John. "Please, give my 2 sons high jobs when you become king," said James and John's mother to Jesus. When the other disciples heard the mother talking to Jesus, it made them feel very angry toward James and John, and they said unkind words to each other. Jesus was worried about this fighting among his disciples. They seemed to spend a lot of time arguing about which one was the greatest. Jesus loved all the disciples, and he had one big wish for them. Jesus wanted them to understand that the one who was the greatest was the one who served and cared for others. That idea didn't make sense to the disciples. Their idea of being great meant being served by other people. Each disciple thought, "Let others do the serving. I'm too important for that work." Jesus told stories to try to get the disciples to understand what he meant. He prayed for them and asked God to help them change. But the 12 disciples continued to argue about which one was the greatest, which was the most important, who was the best. It was now almost 3 years since Jesus closed the door of the carpenter shop in Nazareth. 3 years since he began the work his heavenly Father had sent him to do. For 3 years he had worked miracles. He had taught lessons to crowds of people, and he had blessed children. Now Jesus knew that his work on this earth was almost done. It was almost time for the great plan of saving people to be finished. "I would like you to go ahead and get a place ready for us to eat the Passover supper," Jesus said to 2 of the disciples. He was sending Peter and John to find a room where the 12 disciples and Jesus could eat a meal together and have a little time to talk together. "Where do you want us to go?" they asked. "As you enter the city of Jerusalem, you will see a man walking. The man will be carrying a pitcher of water," Jesus answered. Then Jesus gave them exact instructions. "Follow the man until he gets to his house and is just ready to go in," Jesus said. "Tell him our teacher says for you to show us the guest room where we can eat the Passover. He will take you upstairs to a large room, all ready for us." Peter and John went off to the city and found everything just as Jesus had said. First, they saw the man carrying a pitcher of water. Then they followed him until he was ready to go into the house. Quickly, they talked to him.
"Our teacher says for you to show us the guest room, where we can eat the Passover supper."
The man took them upstairs to the guest room, and Peter and John were surprised to find everything just as Jesus had said. Late that afternoon, Jesus and the other 10 disciples arrived. When it was time to sit down, the disciples were still thinking about who was the most important in their group. Judas, the treasurer or money keeper, pushed his way against the other disciples so he could sit next to Jesus at the table. John quickly took the place on the other side of Jesus. You remember, it was John's mother who had asked Jesus to give him and his brother an important job when Jesus became king. Once all the men were seated, they expected a servant would be there to help them get ready to eat. In Bible times, men wore sandals on their feet without socks. Walking along the dirty, dusty roadways made their feet dirty. It was always expected that a servant would be ready to wash the feet of guests before a meal was served. Now, Peter and John had arranged for this upstairs room, but they hadn't talked to the owner about having a servant there to wash their feet. A pitcher of water was there in the corner. A towel was there and a pan for washing their feet. The only thing missing was the servant. It should have been one of the disciples who got up and began washing Jesus' feet, but no one moved. Each disciple was thinking quietly to himself, "I'm not going to do the servant's job. I am the most important of the disciples. Let one of the other men wash Jesus' feet." Jesus waited to see what they would do. The disciples kept on talking to one another. They pretended not to notice that something was missing. But Jesus saw and understood everything that was happening. And Jesus knew something the disciples did not know. Jesus knew this would be the very last meal he would eat with these 12 disciples. This was his last chance to teach them what it meant to be great. This was his last chance to teach them what it meant to serve. Quietly, Jesus, the Son of God, stood up. He took off his outer coat and then reached for the towel and pitcher of water. The disciples watched in surprise to see what would happen next. The room was silent now. No one spoke a word. Jesus poured water from the pitcher into the pan and walked to one of the men and began to wash his feet and wipe them with the towel. The disciples could not believe their eyes. Here was Jesus, their leader, their master, the Son of God, and the creator of the world. And he was surely the greatest of them all. Yet Jesus was serving them. He was washing their feet. He was taking the place of the missing servant. How ashamed they were! How terrible they felt! Jesus continued around the table. He went from one disciple to another. When he came to Peter, Peter said,
"Master, you shouldn't be washing our feet like this."
Jesus replied, "It's all right, Peter. You don't understand why I am doing this, but someday you will."
"No!"
shouted Peter.
"You shall never wash my feet."
"But if you don't let me wash your feet, you can't be my disciple," Jesus answered. And Peter sat quietly while Jesus washed his feet. An important thing happened that night around the table in the upstairs room. Jesus did more than wash the feet of his disciples. He changed their hearts. They were really, truly sorry for the way they had acted. They were ashamed that Jesus had done the work of the servant instead of one of them. Jesus' act of serving the disciples changed their hearts. They had come into the upstairs room full of bad feelings toward one another. Who was the greatest? Who was the most important? Who was Jesus' favorite? Who was the best? These were the questions they were thinking about. These questions had been in their minds for almost 3 years. All the time they had been Jesus' disciples. These questions had made the disciples argue and fight with one another. But as they watched Jesus take the towel and pour the water, those questions left their minds. As Jesus washed their feet and wiped them with a towel, they forgot about themselves. Their hearts were open to Jesus' love and their hearts were changed. Jesus the Peacemaker. Jesus showed his disciples how to really be the greatest. It is by serving and helping others. Some people think you have to have a war to make peace. Some people think you have to argue and shout to solve a problem. Some children think you have to push and shove to get your turn. Jesus showed that quiet kindness can help people get over being angry. A smile or a friendly word can stop someone from being mean. All around the world today, people have problems. Nations and countries of the world have problems with each other. Husbands and wives have problems in their marriages. Brothers and sisters have trouble getting along with each other at home. Girls and boys get angry at each other on the playground at school. Jesus taught his disciples to settle their problems the peaceful way, and he wants you to settle your problems the peaceful way too. The